All right, so now we are recording. So welcome to our 13th annual Winter Green Up. We're really excited to have you here. Obviously, this is a different format than our usual in-person meeting, but we're really excited to try a new way to deliver great new grazing information. The screen that you're seeing right now lists two of our sponsors for this year. So we're really thankful to have Eat From Farms and Big Picture Beef helping to make this event possible. Later in the meeting, Tom's going to tell us a little bit more about these two organizations and yeah, give you a little background on them. So my name is Ashley, and I'm the livestock agent for the Capital Area Ag and Hort program team. And I cover 6 counties in the Upper Hudson Valley. So I cover Albany, Schenectady, Rensselaer, Columbia, Greene, and Washington counties. And I work on a team with other agents as well. So we have business educators, we have an agronomist, we have a horticulture specialist. And so if there's anything that we can do for you and you know, within those areas or beyond, please feel free to reach out to us. I'm gonna give my two co-planners, Tom and Sammy, a chance to introduce themselves as well.
I guess I'll start out. I'm Tom Gallagher. I've been with Cooperative Extension for quite a few years and helped to begin this conference 13 years ago, as you can see. As Ashley mentioned, this is going to be a totally different format, as most educational programs are right now. We're hoping to be successful and people get a lot out of each week. We tried to keep it short because I think some people are getting zoomed out. So to have a speaker each week, we thought was a good format. And we'll certainly ask for your input at the end of the 3 weeks of how we could do things differently. And I'll reiterate thanks to our sponsors that Ashley just mentioned. They've been with us. I think both of them have been with us all 13 years or certainly close to it. So we really appreciate them helping to cover some of the costs for this conference. I'll turn it over to Sammy.
Hi, everyone. I'm Sammy Baker. I'm one of the local ag agents out of Albany County. This is my second year with Extension and my first year helping with Winter Green Up. So I'm super excited to be here and I'm so happy that you all could be here with us.
Great, thank you guys. So I'm going to read a little bio on our speaker today, Elizabeth. So Elizabeth Marks serves as a biologist for the United States Department of Agriculture Natural Resource Conservation Service in the Hudson Valley in New York. She's a certified holistic management educator since 2013, and she works with landowners to improve soil health and biological diversity on their farms and forests. In addition, she is an instructor for the New York State Beginning Women Farmer Program and has taught workshops on holistic management principles. In 2020, she worked on a 1-year special project with the USDA Northeast Climate Hub, developing a training on climate change and how farmers can adapt to it. Elizabeth received a bachelor's degree in biology from Mount Holyoke College. She lives in Chatham, New York, in a net zero energy efficient home that she designed herself. And one last thing I wanted to say was that we'd welcome you to chat or type in the chat box if you have any questions, and Sammy and I will monitor that and relay questions to Elizabeth. And also feel free to unmute yourself if you'd like to ask the question yourself. About midway through, we're going to take a little break because I know this is a long meeting. So everyone can kind of stretch their legs and take a little break from the screen, and then we'll come back and finish the second half. So I think that's all I have, and I would love to turn it over to Elizabeth to tell us more about weathering the change.
Thank you, Ashley, Tom, and Sammy. It's great to be here today, although I must admit I'm really sad. I loved getting together at the Century House. I love this conference. It was always so great to see people share ideas. We're going to do our best today to do that. And so I really want to encourage people, if you have questions, if you have comments, feel free to use the chat box or your microphone. One of the great things about a conference is you get to listen to your fellow farmers and share ideas. And so I really hope we can still do that. So if I share something about a specific grazing technique or information that you have a different experience or you've had good experience with, you've had bad experience, I really want to hear that. Because I think we all want to hear that. Most of us are grazers on here. So learning from each other is just one of the reasons why we come to conferences. So I don't want to be the only person talking for the next 2 hours. So feel free to interrupt. And Kim already asked how many are expected today. Looks like we've got 23 who are joining us. So today's presentation, what I'm going to talk about is climate change and how you as livestock farmers can be resilient to that. Let's see. Hold on a second. Okay. So Ashley already introduced me. I am a biologist with NRCS New York. Is there anybody who has worked with NRCS, received any funding or technical assistance from us? Feel free to write in the chat box or say yes in the participant box. This past year, I had the good fortune to be chosen to work on a 1-year special assignment with the USDA Northeast Climate Hub, and I was NRCS's liaison to the hub. And my project was, or my focus was to develop a training for USDA employees, both live and on our Ag Learn system. So soil and water folks, I saw I have some friends from the Washington County Soil and Water. If you have access to Ag Learn, this training in a full version will also be available in Ag Learn. So my purpose this year was to develop the training, and then I've been giving it to USDA folks and then also farmers where when I've been asked. I'm also a certified holistic educator. Is anybody else on here familiar with holistic management? So if you have worked with NRCS, put that in the chat box. If you are familiar with holistic management, can you also write in the chat box as well? I also have a picture here of 2 of my co-managers on my small farm. On my left is, or on the left is my horse Butters. I call him the brawn of part of the management team. I'm the brains, he's the brawn. If anybody has grazed horses, they know they're probably the most challenging animal to graze. However, I will also say they have the best work ethic. So it's just a matter of directing them. And you may hear also my Jack Russell Terrier. Hopefully I won't get anybody coming to the door like I did last time I did a training. But if you hear that barking, that's my Jack Russell Biscuit. So I have Butters and Biscuit. Okay, so it looks like Janet, you're familiar with holistic management. Fantastic. Is there anybody, I also wanted to ask, I'm going to assume most people are from New York. If there's anybody who's joining us from outside of New York, can you just put the state that you're from in the chat box? So for today's presentation, I'm going to talk about climate change trends over the past 125 years in the United States. Why these changes are occurring, some hope, and then I want to talk about climate smart farming for livestock farmers. So some techniques that you as livestock farmers can use to adapt to our changing and weather and climate. And again, want to encourage you to please ask questions or share your experience. Even if it's something, if I say that you disagree with, let me know. Let's have a dialogue. Annalie, sounds like you're familiar with holistic management. Manuel, that's awesome. Great. And is that G. Klepp? Is that Gary Kleppel? I think it might be.
Yes.
Yes? Oh, hi, Gary. I'm so glad you could join.
Hi, Elizabeth.
Great.
Wouldn't miss it for the world.
Oh, good. We've got a lot of experienced folks on today. So just a quick definition of weather versus climate. Weather is happening at a point in time. Climate is a general trend in weather. So it's just kind of the average weather. climate change, unfortunately, has become a bit of a politicized term. When you're talking with other people, you might find weather volatility, weather extremes, changing weather patterns, weather unpredictability. Those might be other terms that aren't as triggering, perhaps. They're all acceptable. I use them all the time. But sometimes climate change has a certain political connotation to it. I'm also going to be talking about climate smart farming, and this is a term that we're starting to hear more and more. Some other ways to describe this are natural climate solutions, engineering with nature, weather drought resiliency, or soil health. Soil health is a big component of climate smart farming, but it's not just soil health. There are other things that are part of it. So I like to put this cartoon up. What if it's all a big hoax and we create a better world for nothing? You don't necessarily have to believe in climate change to get something out of today's presentation. What I'm going to talk about today is going to help you on the farm, make your farm more productive, more resilient to weather, and you don't even have to believe that climate change is happening. So I want to open it up to folks. What changes in weather have you noticed in your lifetime? And if you're not from New York, if you could just say where you're from. So has anybody noticed in their lifetime any changes? Feel free to use the chat box or microphone.
Elizabeth, this is Jim Taylor. I'm over in Athens.
Okay.
I've been farming here on this farm for close to 50 years now. At this time of the year, traditionally, we would be down in the swamp. We have a nice big swamp that runs through the middle of the farm. We'd be down there taking firewood logs off out of the swamp this time of the year because the ground would be frozen, the swamp would be frozen. You could, go practically any place you want. The last few years, it's not something that's even feasible because there's very, very little frost in the ground. And a lot of times we have open running water in the swamp and the ice only gets to be a few inches thick and then melts again. And then you get a couple inches of ice where we used to have sometimes it'd be frozen almost solid to the bottom of the water, and it's just not happening anymore. We don't have the snow cover that we used to have when we first moved here, and we do not have the extreme cold in the wintertime. The other day I was in my garden and I was looking at my blueberry plants, and I noticed that the buds are already starting to swell. The beginning of January, I have buds on my blueberries that seem to be a little puffy. And the maple trees have been dripping sap too. So that's a change. We could be tapping maple trees right now. And that's a dramatic change that I've seen just in, the 50 years that I've been here. I've had the discussion with people when they say climate change is just a hoax. It's not real. And then I point out things like, my great grandfather.
Oh, Jim, are you there? Did we just lose Jim? Can people hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, but looks like we just, well, thank you, Jim. Thank you for those observations. Anybody else want to share?
We got a few in the chat box.
Sure. So, Emily says bigger, more frequent rainstorms, less snow. Janet says the weather seems to get stuck in patterns, dry periods and endless rainy periods. Yeah, I've seen that too. Lynn says heavier rainstorms. Anybody else? Tom, you must have noticed some weather changes. What have you
we're
noticed?
seeing is less snow, although people won't believe it after our snowstorm in December. But I remember as a kid growing up, you always had huge snow banks to make tunnels and do all kinds of, and you don't see as much of that as you used to.
Mm,
And I agree with the weather patterns. You go long periods without rain and long periods where it rains every day, which makes it very difficult, especially if you're
Yeah.
making hay or something like that.
oh yeah, for sure. Anybody else want to share? Gary, how about you? Gary Clapel?
Yep, here I am.
Okay.
I was actually thinking about some relatives and friends out west who talk about there used to be a fire season and now there's no fire season. It's just continuous fires because they're so hot and dry.
Yeah. Pam says, definitely, I have noticed more extremes, longer periods without rain than long periods of excess. Barb says, big snowstorm early before water freezes. Yeah, we've certainly seen that the last couple of years. Karina says, more significant rain events during the winter. Yup. Anybody else want to share? How about somebody who's maybe younger, like Amber? Amber, have you noticed any changes in your lifetime? Or has it been pretty much the same?
From when I was younger, there's larger swings in the weather.
Yeah,
Patterns. That's what I've noticed.
that's a good observation. Anybody else?
I think the one thing we didn't mention is temperature. We don't seem to have those long periods of below zero weather lately. You know, we get 1 or 2 days in the whole winter.
Yeah, yeah. All right, well, some of the things that I've noticed in my lifetime is I grew up in the Adirondacks. I graduated high school in 1990, so you can kind of get a sense of how old I am. But when I lived in the Adirondacks, we didn't have ticks. Then about 10 years ago, I went back to my hometown on Lake George and at Thanksgiving and pulled a tick off my friend's dog. And that was pretty shocking to me to realize, like, okay, growing up, we didn't have to worry about ticks or Lyme disease. And now there are ticks in the Adirondacks. Another shocking thing that happened is there's a big wetland behind my house. I live in Chatham in Columbia County. And last 2 out of the 5 winters, I've heard spring peepers in the wetland in January. That was pretty disturbing to me. Let's see, I think there might have been a couple more things in the chat. So Tony says there have been thunderstorms earlier in the season. One I can remember a few years ago was in February. Yeah, isn't that freaky when it's like January and there are thunderstorms? Yeah, Barb says thunderstorms hit and miss area. Yeah. So we'll talk about some of the changes that have been happening and put some data to what you guys have all been observing. So for this part of the presentation, I've been taking a lot of information from the 4th National Climate Assessment. This is a 1,500-page congressionally mandated report. It's done every 4 years by the U.S. Global Change Research Program. It's federally funded. The lead agency is NOAA, but there are many other contributors, including USDA. So the average global rise in temperature worldwide has been 2 degrees Fahrenheit since 1880. I like looking at this map because you can see that not all parts of the world are warming at the same rate. We actually have a little spot, looks like in the North Atlantic, that might even be a little bit cooler, but places like United States, you can see Russia, they're experiencing a large increase in temperature. In fact, I even heard recently that Russia is expected to be kind of the next bread belt because some of their areas that have been cooler and not so suitable for wheat are thawing. And of course, if they haven't been farmed, they've got a lot of organic matter. So they might be have a lot more wheat production and crop production in the future. Here's what's happening in the United States. And so is anybody else from outside of New York? If so, put in your information in the chat box, just say what state you're from. But this is what this is what the United States looks like in terms of global or the temperature change. So in the Northeast, we are experiencing quite a bit of temperature increase, a little bit more than the world average, because that is due in part to the Gulf of Maine is one of the fastest warming parts of the ocean in the world. Oh, hi, Manuel, you're from Panama. That's fantastic. Thanks for joining. You can see the upper central Midwest is also warming. Big hotspot in Utah, Colorado area, and then Southern California. What I find interesting is that if you look at the Southeast, Alabama, Mississippi, Georgia area, that area is actually staying the same or might even be getting a little cooler. So it's really interesting to see the different changes throughout the US. And here's just a close-up of the Northeast. You can see the coastal areas are warming more so than the mountainous areas. Here's a change in growing season length since 1895. I'm just muting, I'm hearing some background noise. I'm just going to mute folks. Feel free to unmute yourself if you would like to speak. So this is a map of the change in growing season length since 1895. You can see New York, we're about, I think, 3 weeks, where parts of California, Arizona, they're up to almost 6 weeks, whereas Georgia has even decreased a little bit. One of the indicators of our growing season length is how much longer our pests are active. If we take mosquitoes as an indicator, you can see since 1980, the top 25 cities with the largest increase in annual average days with ideal climate conditions for mosquitoes. If you look at number 10, Albany is number 10. There's been an increase of a month of mosquitoes being more active just since 1980. You can see Syracuse is number 17. We're not only experiencing temperature increase or temperature changes, but we're also seeing increases in rainfall in the Northeast. So big changes in rainfall that's happening since 1895. So take a look at New York, and we'll discuss New York a little bit more in depth, but you'll see that the Northeast, again, upper Midwest, even parts of Northern California are seeing increase in rainfall. So wet areas are tending to become wetter, where dry areas like Arizona, the Southwest, is becoming much drier. A few of you remarked that we're seeing not only an increase in rainfall, but an increase in heavy rainfall. And that is absolutely true. So If you look at the percent increase in very high precipitation, so that is defined as over 2 inches in a 24-hour period, that's increased 71% since the mid-50s. Now that is an average for the Northeast. You can see the Northeast has seen the biggest increase, or in the eastern part of the US. But when you break that down to New York, it's much higher. So the coastal areas are seeing less of a change in the increased intensity of rainfall. It's when you get more inland and in the mountainous areas where that very high precipitation change is happening. So let's look at what's happening in New York. The information that I'm presenting in this part has come from NOAA. NOAA has put together these incredible state summaries of what has been happening in each state over the last 125 years. It also goes into predictions for the future. I'm not really talking about predictions today, but if you are interested in what the predictions are, they're in these state summaries. I highly recommend them. They're very short, like a 4 to 5 page fact sheet. You pick which state that you are interested in, and you can print out a PDF. So let's talk about, or first of all, any questions? So let's talk about what's happening in New York. So in New York, the average temperature has increased 2 degrees Fahrenheit since 1900. So that's about what the global average is. Average rainfall has increased about 15% since 1895, with the highest increase happening in central New York. There are parts in central New York that are seeing a 25, 30% increase. The 15% is statewide, kind of the average statewide, but central New York, Tug Hill Plateau is seeing a very big increase in rainfall. There's been a 143% increase in number of days where rainfall has exceeded 2 inches in a 24-hour period. So we are seeing these much more intense rainfalls. Warmer winters and increased rain in winter and spring means longer mud seasons and delayed planting. I forgot who spoke at the beginning, but who was talking about the wetlands not freezing over, so you can't get in there to cut wood, and that's spot on to what the data is showing. And then sea level, for those of, do we have anybody in the coastal area, Long Island? Feel free to write in the chat box, but sea levels have risen 13 inches since 1880, which is higher than the global average of 8 inches. Any questions so far about the New York data? So here are just some charts to look at, and this is the observed winter temperature. You can see our winter temperatures are increasing by quite a bit. This is also in part due to cloud cover. I've also heard people say it's a lot cloudier now in New York, and that is true. So clouds in the winter time actually keep they have a little bit of an insulating effect, so they do keep the area warmer in winter. Here's the observed number of very hot days in New York. These are with temperatures above 95 degrees. You can see it's actually decreased a little bit. And again, this is probably due to the cloud cover, which is bringing more rain as well. Here's the observed annual precipitation. You can see there's been a huge difference mean, back in the 50s and 60s, there was quite a bit, it was a quite dry period, but you're looking at a difference between 35 inches to about now we're getting about 45 inches a year on average. So that's quite a bit of difference in rainfall. And then here's the observed number of extreme precipitation events over 2 inches in a 24-hour period. You can see the changes there over the last 100 years. So why are these changes happening? Well, most of you have probably heard about the greenhouse effect, where sunlight hits the earth, and some of that is trapped by these greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide. Some's reflected back out to space, but most of it kind of is trapped by this layer of greenhouse gases. Now, these greenhouse gases, this is what makes Earth livable, that we're able to kind of regulate our temperature. The problem is when we have too much greenhouse gases, and the earth begins to heat up. I like to describe this or think of this as a pickup truck effect. So if you've got your truck parked on a sunny day, could be summer, could be winter, you have all the windows rolled up, and that sunlight hits the glass. Shortwave energy gets in, it gets converted and radiated out as longwave energy, and that energy can't escape. So it starts to heat up and is much hotter than the outside temperature. So that's how greenhouse gases work. They're like the glass in the truck. So what are the greenhouse gases and where are they coming from in the US? The top four are water vapor, carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Ozone, chlorofluorocarbons, and hydrofluorocarbons are some greenhouse gases, but they're not as prevalent. Where they're coming from in the US, the majority are being released through transportation, through cars, and electricity generation. 22% is industry, 12% is commercial and residential, and 9% is agriculture. Concentrations of greenhouse gases over the last 2,000 years. So we look at carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, and look at their levels over the last 2,000 years. They've been pretty steady. I mean, they'll go up and down, fluctuate a little bit. Then you get to about 1880, which is represented by the pink line. And all of a sudden you see those greenhouse gases just do a vertical straight up. So that is due to, if you think about what's happening at the end of the 19th century, you've got the beginning of the second industrial revolution, electric lights are invented, you've got the automobile invented. So you're starting to see this tremendous removal of oil and gas that's been stored within the earth, combusted and put up into the atmosphere. And the temperature, the increase in global temperature has been consistent with the rise in these greenhouse gases. If you look over the last 800,000 years and what the carbon dioxide levels have been on Earth, and we have really good data on this because we can measure historical carbon dioxide levels through ice core data. For the last 800,000 years, again, carbon dioxide has fluctuated in the atmosphere, but it's never gone above 300 parts per million until about the 1950s. So for 800,000 years, it's been, it was below 300 parts per million. This year, it is actually, the current level is 413. So I'd love everybody just to take a second and switch over, if you can, to your smartphone or your computer. Just Google what the carbon dioxide levels were the year that you were born. So just take a second, Google carbon dioxide level, and then the year that you were born. And what was the carbon dioxide level when people were born? Anybody want to share? I forget what my number is. I have to Google it. Janet says 314. Samantha 362, Ashley 348. Annalie, we know you guys are younger. I'm 327. Oh, Janet 314. Oops, sorry about that. Yeah, so pretty shocking seeing everybody's numbers come in. Yeah, so you can see how it's really risen quite a bit over the last 70 years. And in fact, half of all human-related carbon dioxide emissions has occurred only in the last 40 years. Oop. Sorry, hold on. Okay. So we know why the temperatures are increasing, because we've got all this greenhouse gas in the atmosphere. But why are many areas getting wetter? So when you add greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, that's going to increase temperatures. It's going to trap more heat. When you trap more heat, water vapor concentration increases, there's more evaporation. And then with more water in the atmosphere, that's also a greenhouse gas. So that also traps more heat. So it's kind of this vicious cycle. So we've got more water in the atmosphere. A couple people mentioned that it seems like we have more extreme weather. Boy, I've really noticed that. I think, was it last winter where it was something like -10 one day, and then a couple days later, it was like 50 or 60 degrees. Well, they think that we're having more extreme weather because the jet stream is becoming wavier. So it's becoming more amplified. So we have more of those extremes. One of the reasons why we're also having more rainfall is that storms are moving slower with climate change. And so they'll tend to dump more water. And, you know, we certainly saw that in Texas, where they received like 55 inches within a couple of days. You can kind of see how damaging these inland flooding events are. If you look at the US billion-dollar disaster events since 1980, which one stands out as having grown the most recently? Anyone? What color do you see the most dominated in the past 10 years? Green, yes. Yeah, so the green is the severe storm count. So, and in fact, I think there were more billion-dollar disaster events from inland flooding in the past 10 years than the previous 30 years combined. You know, part of that is we have more stuff. We're going to have more, so more stuff to, more people, more stuff to be damaged. There's also runoff and flooding, but a lot of the flooding is also coming from these increased rainfalls. Okay, now that I've probably thoroughly depressed you, I do want to give you some reasons for hope. So here's what's making me hopeful about climate change. The new administration, well, some folks connected with the new administration have written this Climate 21 transition memo with a number of recommendations. The lead author is Robert Bonney. He's a former undersecretary at USDA under the Obama administration. And they are recommending that the president put climate change as a priority. And in fact, part of the right side of screen, okay, I just accidentally hit something. I wonder if I minimize the chat, if that, I did just hit something. So I'm wondering if, is that better? Can somebody tell me? Okay, I think, yeah, okay, it was the cat. All right, I did accidentally hit something and there's some sort of, there's some sort of setting that will show the chat box. So I'm not able to look at the chat box. So if you don't mind monitoring that, Ashley, that would be great.
Yeah, for sure.
And unless somebody knows how to change that setting back, but I did accidentally hit something. Maybe it's optimized for video. I don't know. Anyway, so the secretary nominee, Vilsack, who was the USDA secretary under Obama and is Biden's nomination for, to be secretary, he has come out and said our number one priority is to make sure everyone is fed under our COVID crisis. And then the number two priority is going to be addressing climate change. And so these were just some of the recommendations in this transition memo, and really looking at NRCS to play a bigger part there with all our funding. NRCS actually gets $3.3 billion a year for technical assistance and financial assistance to farmers and land managers. And a lot of this money could be prioritized for climate smart farming. And they recognize some climate smart farming practices such as conservation tillage, cover crops, improved nutrient management, reforestation, and methane digesters. So another reason for hope is the U.S. hit peak greenhouse gas emissions in 2007, and we've been going down ever since. And in 2020, with the COVID crisis, it actually saw the largest drop in greenhouse gases ever recorded. So some of the reasons for the drop in greenhouse gas emissions is our switch from electric generation using coal-fired generation and oil-fired generation to werenewable energy. And, you know, I've certainly seen this where solar farms are popping up all over the place. So we're really starting to make the switch to renewable energy. The USDA has a number of really great resources. Has anybody used Comet Farm? Comet Farm, which helps farmers look at look at different practices to see if they're what practices sequester carbon or use carbon. Anybody use that? Certainly our conservation funding programs like EQIP, the Conservation Reserve Program and Conservation Stewardship Program. The climate hubs are a great resource. We do a lot of monitoring. We have these SCAN and T-SCAN weather monitoring stations. Our soil health initiative has been really fantastic. NRCS has also done actually about 10 years ago, did a rapid carbon mapping project where we looked at where carbon is being stored all across the United States. It was a huge project. So we have a good baseline of where our carbon is being stored. And interestingly enough, does anybody know where our carbon in the United States is mainly stored? Oh, Janet, you said if you look at view in the upper right-hand corner, you can choose how the screen looks. I know I hit a setting. Janet, yeah, you said it's stored in the soil. Yes, that's a given. But do you know where in the United States? Where do you think most of our carbon is being stored? Aaron, Gabriel, I saw you on. Do you have any thoughts, Tom?
Well, in soils, are you speaking geographically where in the US?
Yes, yep.
Well, wherever there's addition of carbon and wherever it's not decomposing the fastest, I guess.
Right. So where in the United States, like what geographic area do you think?
I would say where it's moist and cool.
All right. But I would say like,
the
Would that be like
Northeast.
the Northeast? Yeah, the North.
oh, who was that?
Oh, sorry, that's me. Is it the Northeast?
So kind of. Well, so historically, most of our carbon was stored in the prairie plains from grasslands because grass is oops, sorry, I'm trying to minimize the chat box here. That's where historically most of our carbon has been stored, in the prairie plains. Due to farming, our carbon is now being mostly stored in the United States in the northern forests. And that's because those forests aren't disturbed, so we're not losing the carbon through tillage. And in cooler areas, carbon is more is stored easier because you don't have the breakdown through biological activity. Okay, so climate hubs. There are 10 climate hubs across the country. They're this awesome USDA collaboration. They've got a wealth of information. So I recommend you go and check out their website. They also have a quarterly newsletter. And the other thing that gives me hope, and what we'll talk about today, are different farming practices can help farms be resilient to weather volatility. And here are just some components of climate smart farming. The first is landscape vulnerability, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Improving natural resources. improving the water, mineral cycles, biological community, and energy flow on the farm. Those of you who are familiar with holistic management that may sound familiar. You can also be resilient to climate change by increasing infrastructure like high tunnels, irrigation, drainage. I'm not going to talk about that today because they can be expensive. I'm going to focus on improving natural resources. Okay, so we're time for a break.
Awesome. Thank you, Elizabeth. So I'm going to pull up our sponsors and let Tom introduce them. Hold on 1 second, please. All right, so Tom, whenever you're ready, I can advance slides.
All right, thanks, Ashley. Again, we want to thank our sponsors for helping to fund this program. It certainly helps to keep prices down. And a lot of people say when you're doing virtual like this, there aren't any costs, but there are costs involved. And we're glad we can do this program at a very reasonable price. So we'll start with Big Picture Beef. Big Picture Beef, it's a unique model of production and distribution. It's 100% grass-fed beef in the Northeast. It's Ridge Shin. I think you're familiar with the name. If you've been to the winter green up in the past, Ridge has been there for many years. So he started into the marketplace in 2017, and he's in stores, he's in restaurants, which is kind of tough these days, as you know, and institutional things all over the Northeast. I'm not familiar with the big wide grocery chain, but it must be further east of us or north. And there are 70 stores in that chain. Ridge is the CEO, and he's had experience in almost every facet of grass-fed beef production. I think we might even had him as a speaker early on with Winter Green Up and some of his production practices. I'm going to move to the next one, Ashley. The main thing Ridge wanted to do today was he is actively recruiting cow-calf producers and people finishing animals. And then it gives you a little bit more background that you can read here, but he's visited herds all over the world in England, France, Uruguay, and so on. He was featured in Time Magazine. I think we brought that out at a Green Up back in those days on climate change. The Carbon Cowboy. So I can't, we can call Elizabeth maybe the Carbon Cowgirl. But so there's the contact information on the bottom for Ridge, and we'll have that available at the end of our conference. But if you have some interest or want more details on what he's doing, what he's looking for, there's the phone number and the rest of his contact information. And we could probably put that right in the chat box, Ashley, I think.
Okay, I can do that.
And then we'll move to the next one, which is Eat from Farms. George Duggan has been with us for many years at the Winter Green Up, and he is here today, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time reviewing what we've got here on the screen, but I'll let him talk about his programs, how they've developed, and where they're at this point. So George, if you want to unmute yourself and jump in with a little description of what you do with Eat from Farms, that would be great.
Okay, Tom, can you hear me?
Yep, sounds
good. Okay, very good. Basically, what we have designed here is a platform for farmers to be able to create their own online store in a way that's very different than most online stores. Farmers are quite different in their operation. They have variable price products. They have farm pickup, they have delivery locations, sometimes home delivery, and now that's getting more popular. They like to collaborate, and most shopping cart systems won't allow you to do all that. Our system is designed specifically to do that so that you can operate much more efficiently. We're low cost. We only charge $15 a month. And other similar platforms, and there aren't very many of them, charge a whole lot more, $80 a month, $125 a month. What we do is charge $15 a month. You can have the entire store functionality for that price, and you can also build a website on it if you don't have a website now. If you do have a website, you can simply create like a purchase online or a shop button on your website, and it'll link right over to your account with us. And you will be able to offer people, all of your customers, any of the items that you have available. We have real-time inventory on it, so they're going to know exactly what you have and don't have. So when they place an order, they can feel assured that they're going to be able to get it. A lot of our farmers now are collaborating. They are bringing in other vendors that are near them and working together so that their customers can order a wider variety of foods, and it all comes in on one order. As a matter of fact, something we didn't expect, but COVID has brought, is that we now have farmers markets using our platform in 5 different states. And they are simply using the functionality we put together years ago of having a primary vendor and then having the sub-vendor accounts. And so it works out very nicely for them. And we're very happy to have them jumping on board, and especially at a time like this when everybody's scraping for solutions to things, we've been able to do that. So if you have a website but don't have a farm store, this is a great way to go. And if you don't have a website, it's even a better way because there's no extra cost to build a website. Our system is very easy to use. That's one of the things about it. Farmers say it all the time. They get on our platform, and I always offer to walk them through the software and show them how things work. There's nothing to download. You just log in. And very often when I hear back, well, I'll see them all of a sudden come online. They're all ready to go without me even speaking with them. But what I hear across the board is this is so much easier to use than anything else they have done. The website editor, where you'd build web pages, is very much like a Microsoft Word. It's very easy to use. It's common types of buttons, and it's an easy to use system all the way along. So that's a preview of what there is. If you're interested, you can certainly look at our website at eatfromfarms.com. I can be reached at the phone number that is on the screen, and can also be reached through the website itself. And certainly you can email. The startup cost is $60. That is not a setup fee. Basically, we give you a $60 credit toward your invoices. We create invoices every couple of months. It's a very efficient system and easy to use, and be happy to talk with any of you. If anyone has any questions, I'd be happy to answer them. Or if at the end of the show here, also I'll hang around a little bit in case anyone has any questions. But certainly you can call or write at any time, and our website is there for you 24/7. Thanks, Tom.
Okay, thanks, George. And if anybody wants to put a question in the box, we can pass that along to George too. Or if anybody has a quick question right now, you can unmute yourself. We got about 2 minutes left in our break, and I think Elizabeth should be all pumped up. And the last thing we got, kind of a friend of the winter green up, is Larry Lampman. You've seen Larry at the green up several times. He's been reducing his herd size. And as you can see here, we told him we just let people know that he's got 10 cows left and a couple of bulls that he's going to be selling this year. He's got 4 Murray Gray and 6 British white cows and 2 Murray Gray bulls. And you see his phone number up on the top of the screen. If you may have some interest in these breeds, give Larry a call. He couldn't be with us today, but he'll probably be available next week on the program. So I think, again, thanks to our sponsors. We really appreciate it. Ridge will probably be with us next week, along with George. So I'll turn it back to you, Ashley, or do you want to go straight to Elizabeth?
Do you want to take maybe a 5-minute break to stretch and come back to Elizabeth?
That's okay with me.
Yeah, we'll just take a second. And yeah, so what I have on my phone here is 2:03, so maybe 2:08 we'll come back and get started.
I'll give everybody
Great, and
get a drink or something.
And that will help me figure out the chat box issue.
All right, we'll see you all in 5 minutes.
I'm just going to share my screen, Ashley, so I can fix this setting that just happened. Ashley or Tom,
Yep.
can you see the dark? Can you see my full screen, or do you see it blanked out on the right-hand side a little bit?
No, I can see your full screen.
Okay, great.
Sorry, I was muted. No, it looks good.
Okay, so this is what happened. I accidentally hit optimize for video clip under more. I don't know if you, and so that's what happened.
That looks good.
If anybody has any questions, now would be a good time to ask.
Maybe everybody did go on break. I know.
Hey, I'm still here, Tom. This is Jim Taylor again.
Oh, hi, Jim.
How are
Hi,
you
Jim.
doing, Tom?
We got you back, huh?
Yeah, you got me back.
Good.
We talk about climate change and the weather changing and higher levels of rainfall and stuff like that. So, we farm here in this fantastic old glacial lake bed. And, with
Uh-oh, hope we don't lose him again.
Oh, no.
Sorry, Jim, we didn't do it on purpose.
what's that?
We lost you there for a minute.
Okay. What I'm seeing here with the higher levels of precipitation and, the wetness in the soils is increased levels of compaction, which creates problem with productivity in the pastures and those kind of things. Is there anything we're going to talk about in this for working to help alleviate some of the compaction issues we're seeing in our soils? Anytime you take a piece of equipment across this wetter soils, we're enhancing the compaction of the soils, and it just doesn't go away by itself. We're not getting the freezing and thawing effect that we used to see years ago. We don't get frosts that drive, 3-4 feet into the ground anymore, with the freezing and thawing. And it's just one of the things that it's really near and dear to my heart at this point in time, because I am trying to figure this out pretty much on my own, because you go to places like Soil and Water Conservation and they just scratch their heads and say, we're not here to help you with this kind of stuff. But, so that would be, a good talking point, because soil compaction does have a huge impact on the productivity of the forages and the grasses and the legumes, and the ultimate health of the soil. Because, if the soil can't breathe, it goes anaerobic and you start getting all those other kind of conditions which reduce the quality of the health of the soil. So that was just my thought. And, if there's something that we can talk about in all this, I think it would be beneficial to a lot of people.
Well, Jim, that is a great segue to the second half of the presentation about climate smart farming for livestock producers. So thank you. And Barb, I see you asking about silvopasturing and climate change. And yeah, let's definitely talk about that. So if everybody's ready, did anybody else have any questions about the data that I presented? Anything you disagreed with, or anything different from what you thought or you understood? All right, so let's go into some solutions of how farmers can adapt to this changing climate. All right, so there's three main ways that you can create climate smart farms with planning and improving natural resources. So the first is addressing landscape vulnerability. So this means that marginal land may only become more difficult to farm in the future. The second part is improving soil health, and we'll go a little bit more into that. The third part is increasing the health and diversity of biological organisms above and below ground. I won't talk a lot about that, but because mainly folks, livestock farmers, there's better biological health and diversity for soil organisms or organisms above and below ground, as opposed to crop farmers. So crop farmers, that's a little bit more of a key issue for them. For livestock farmers, since most of you are dealing with perennial systems, pasture or hay, you're pretty good in that department. This is some information. Normally I'm giving this presentation to farmers who do crops and livestock or forest owners, but here are just some practices that are going to be increasingly problematic for farmers. For you guys, leaving bare soil and continuous grazing, that's going to be the most problematic practices for livestock farmers. So let's just talk a little bit about addressing landscape vulnerability. So if we are getting more rain, areas that are wet are going to become wetter. Any areas that are prone to flooding are just going to be more so. So if you have areas that are also prone to erosion, steeper slopes, it's just going to be even more of an issue in the future because of these higher rainfalls. So a solution, and this is going to be good news for you livestock farmers, a solution is to take marginal land out of production and establish perennial systems. So again, marginal land might include steep slopes, frequently flooded or ponded soils, shallow to bedrock soils, soils that easily compact, and areas that are prone to saltwater intrusion. In February, we're going to be giving a workshop for farmers on saltwater intrusion because farmers in the Long Island Sound area are starting to get irrigation wells contaminated with salt water due to sea level rise. But perennial systems include pasture or hay, and conservation buffers. That's another one that's going to be important for farmers. So here are just some examples of perennial systems. So much more important when you have a situation where you have bare soil, but for livestock farmers, that's going to be about having good pasture management, and then thinking about some conservation buffers. You also might be finding that you have issues with erosion in your pastures. And if there's steep enough slopes and you can't control it with good perennial vegetation, that's the first thing to do. You might even have to look into installing diversions. You can see two diversions. Actually, the lower right-hand corner is a diversion of in a pasture. You've got a steep slope hillside, and you can see that swale was constructed to divert water, so it's not coming down that steep hill. That's a diversion. Improving soil health. So this is where I'm going to focus mainly on. And again, I know I recognize a lot of names on this call today. So you guys, I recognize a lot of you do understand improving soil health. So we'll just talk a little bit about this, but I do want to hear from you to see also what you have experienced. So feel free to pipe in with your experience. So if our problem is increased rainfall intensity and hot, drier summers, you know, our traditional practice in New York, which is, you know, you take the worst part of your farm, you fence it in, and you throw animals out there in May and maybe bring them back in September, October. That's not going to work. I don't think that's any surprise to anybody on this call, this webinar. But when you look at, so let's take a look at this, just use this photograph for a moment. What is happening with the water cycle in this pasture? So let's say this pasture gets, it looks very overgrazed, lots of bare soil. What would happen with an intense rainfall in this pasture? What's going to happen to the water?
You're going to get a lot of like a runoff and erosion.
Yes. So the water's going to run off. Where is it not going to go?
Into the soil.
Right. So ideally you want water to infiltrate into the soil and be held there so that when you do get a drier period, that water is released very slowly, like a sponge. So when you have water running off, what's it going to take with it?
The topsoil.
Exactly. And what's in the topsoil?
I did a little test once where I soil sampled soil that washed to the bottom of the field, and then I soil sampled the field. And the stuff at the bottom of the field was quite a bit higher in organic matter and phosphorus.
Yeah. Didn't we do that, Ashley, on your pasture?
Yes, we did. Yeah.
Didn't we find that? Yeah. Right, exactly. So it all washes off, and it's, I mean, I guess it's okay if you own the entire pasture, but if you don't want your nutrients running off, or your soil, that's your wealth in your farm, running off. You want it in place where it's going to be used. Okay, so we've got the soil and nutrients running off, and water running off and not being absorbed into the soil.
You know, Elizabeth, when you have a
Yes, Jim.
situation like the water is continue flowing downhill to the nearest body of water, and here we go with, hang on. when that water continues downstream, it is.
Oh no, Jim, you're coming in and out. Shoot, maybe you can type your question or comment in the chat box. Or I don't know if there was a call-in number. Shoot.
Around.
Oh, are you there?
I'm here. I'm here. Connection.
Yeah, I think you're having
But
connect.
it's
Yeah.
Stream. Yep.
Well, type your
We got to
question in
make
the chat
sure
box.
that the water stays. Okay.
That would be great. Sorry, we started getting the question and then you just cut out. So the solution is to increase organic matter. You've probably heard that this organic matter is really good for your pastures. Kind of organic matter is going to be your insurance policy for climate change. So increasing organic matter, we'll talk first about how to increase organic matter and then what the benefits of increased organic matter are. So the best way to increase organic matter in the soil is through the roots of plants, through grasses and forages. About 1/3 to 1/2 of all grass roots die each year, leaving behind organic matter and channels for water and air. And the great thing about roots, herbaceous roots, is they can get deep into the soil. So it's not just the top. You can add organic matter from manure or plant residues. You can put it on the top or inject it. It will take some time for that organic matter to work its way down into the soil. So roots are the best way. When those roots die, they leave behind channels for water and air and for biological organisms. So that's the two best ways to put in organic matter into the soil. The number one by far is through herbaceous plants. You can also protect organic matter from leaving the soil by not tilling it. So not tilling your soil. The more you till the soil, the more you're going to destroy the pathways in that soil that were made by worms or roots. And then the more biological activity happens, which breaks down that organic matter and releases it up into the air. So some of the benefits of soil organic matter is holding water. It's estimated about 1% of organic matter can hold up to 20,000 gallons of water per acre. That's a little bit more in salt and clay soils and less in sandier soils. It improves soil structure and helps with drainage. It reduces erosion just by increasing soil organic matter from 1% to 3%. You can reduce erosion by 20 to 33%. It provides food for soil organism. It enhances soil microbial biodiversity, which can really help plants resistant to disease and pests. And it improves the cation exchange capacity. The cation exchange capacity is kind of like how sticky is your soil, how much can your soil hold on to nutrients, and then it releases it more slowly. So soil organic matter, it is such a great thing for to being climate smart, to be resilient to climate change. When we talk about soil organic matter, I do want to say it's really important to know the inherent properties of your soil, whether it's silt, sand, or clay. You can improve your soil properties with organic matter, but you can't change them. So if you have a sandy soil, that's always going to be a well-drained soil, or more well-drained than, say, a clay soil. Adding organic matter to sandy soils, you're going to significantly change the way that soil holds onto water. Same thing with clay. You can kind of improve your tilth of clay with organic matter, but know that those inherent properties can't be changed too much. Sometimes we forget about that. Improving the energy flow and soil carbon over a longer period, this is where you guys as pasture managers and hayfield owners, you've got the advantage over crop fields. So if you think about corn going in, corn may only be converting sunlight to energy from May to September, maybe October. Whereas if you've got that perennial vegetation, such as grasses, you are capturing that solar energy and putting it into the soil in the form of roots. So I like to think of pastures as giant solar collectors, and plants are this miraculous, amazing mechanism where it converts sunlight to energy that's usable for us. And that energy is stored in the soil and is kind of like that battery. Oh, Barb, I just wanted to go back. In terms of silvopasturing and climate change, silvopasture is a great climate smart farming technique because it is part of that perennial system, meaning that you've got, if you've got trees in your pasture, you're not going to be able to till up those areas. So you've got that perennial vegetation, and trees can also provide shade. So it is definitely a climate smart farming practice. So another solution is managed grazing. So many of you probably remember Daryl Emick. He was one of my mentors for sure, and so knowledgeable about pasture management. And he did a study back in the 90s in New York that found rest and rotation produces more grass. So if you look at the pasture on the left, and say there's 1 ton of forage in that pasture, and the pasture in the middle, if you divided that pasture into 4 paddocks, and rotated your animals every couple of days, concentrated them in 1 paddock, move them up every couple of days, and let those other 3 paddocks rest, you actually got a 44% increase in forage. So you've got 1 ton, say you have 1 ton of forage in that pasture, just by dividing that pasture into 4 paddocks and rotating, you got 1.44 tons out of that. Now, if you took that same pasture, divided it into 16 paddocks, and all the animals were concentrated in 1 paddock and then rotated among the 16, you had 138% increase when rotated. Now, why would you get so much more pasture, or so much more forage, just by dividing the paddocks?
Doesn't it have to, sorry.
Oh, sorry, go on.
Doesn't it have to do with trying to mimic how grass eaters eat in the wild, like they're in high concentrations in small areas for short periods of time?
Yeah, absolutely. But so you're on the right track. So why would you get more grass? What's happening into the grass?
To my understanding, when you do that, you let them graze and then you move them, and so then the grass is stimulated to grow, and it has a chance to grow before you bring them back onto that section, right?
Yeah. So, yep. So you if you let that forage rest, It's able to grow. It takes energy from the roots. Like, okay, let's think of a grass, blade of grass. It gets eaten to the ground. That blade of grass regrows using energy from its roots, stored energy. And then when it gets to a certain solar collecting surface area, it's able to replenish that energy it took from the roots from the sun. But it has to get to a certain size first before it can actually start convert enough sunlight into energy to replenish the roots. So it is healthier and stronger and able to recover quickly. What else? Why else? So there's a couple things in the chat box here. Concentrating urine and manure. You know, Janet, that's a lot of people will say that. That could be true. Certainly I see that in my horse pasture where my horse tends to like to poop and pee kind of in a general area. And if you do move them around, you might have better distribution if you have animals that are concentrated in one area. Jim says it is the rest of the grass. So maybe just resting the grass. Yep. So resting is definitely making that forage stronger, more plentiful. What else? There's another key reason. Why you get more forage when you allow rest. Anybody else?
Yeah, you're leaving more grass to capture the sunlight as they move out of one and go to the next. So it'll regrow faster.
Yep, because it's stronger. Yep, that's right, Tom. Oh, Alyssa has got the answer I'm looking for. She said when rotating, the animals will eat, stomp down less desirable forage to help stomp out weeds and let higher quality forage regrow. Yeah, so when you concentrate the animals, they start to eat things that they might not necessarily is their first choice. And I know Daryl Emick, we used to call this the salad bar buffet effect, where you've got all this lettuce in the salad bar and you eat some, and then somebody puts more back in the area that you had taken from. So you've got a section of fresher lettuce where you've got this old lettuce. Animals are gonna not want to eat the old vegetation unless they're forced to. So it's a better utilization of grasses and forages when you concentrate them. They're going to eat things that maybe they don't want to eat. If they don't eat it, they'll trample it. So then it gets recycled. Kevin says, but you don't want to graze too short. Hi, Kevin. One of the things that for folks who are grazers, kind of the challenge of grazing is that one thing might be good in one situation, but may not be good in another. As a general rule of thumb, you don't want to graze grass too short, but what it really is you don't want to graze grass before it's recovered. You can actually graze a blade of grass right down to the ground and it not be overgrazed, as long as you have give that blade of grass a chance to recover. So if you have your animal and it eats it right down to the ground, day one, it's not overgrazed. Day two, it's not overgrazed. If you graze it back down after day three, it becomes overgrazed, because overgrazing happens when the plant is grazed, when it has not had a chance to recover the stores of energy in its roots. And there are times when overgrazing can be a great tool. For example, I have horse nettle in my pasture. And this spring, when we just got that flush of green up, I concentrated my horse in the section where there was horse nettle, the weed that I didn't want. and he obliterated it, and it did not grow back the entire season. You can graze short if you want more legumes, or there's a certain section of my pasture that is forbs, and I try to overgraze that area because I want it to move from forbs to grasses. But we're going to talk about some instances where you want your grass to grow tall. Okay, so just that study. I love how grazers have these really fun sayings, like in my last one, it's not the cow, it's the how. Well, when you overgraze the shoot, you overgraze the root. So you can see when you have short grasses, those roots really die off. Now, if you can do a pulse where you have tall grazing, you graze it down short, you let it rest and recover. When I say graze it down short, again, you're not grazing it after day 3 short, you're letting it rest and recover. Then you get that pulse of deep roots dying back, leaving organic matter, and then doing these long roots again. Brett says, we like to bale graze on the weedy and brushy spots in the winter. That creates about 1.5 million pounds acre of density and lots of fertility. I am a huge fan of winter bale grazing, Brett, and I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. So I do want to hear your experience. Alyssa says, we have a huge problem with cleavers. I've heard that sheep and cow can easily get bloat by eating this. Is this true, or do you advice on getting rid of cleavers in the field? Does anybody know about cleavers and bloat? I do not. I think cleavers, is that also a type of bed straw, Alyssa? That's what I'm thinking of for cleavers. Yes, okay. Anybody have experience with cleavers or bed straw and bloat? So I tend to notice that bed straw becomes a problem in horse pastures. The pasture that I have used to be pretty overgrazed by cows, and cows will tend to eat bed straw more than horses. I think the advice on getting rid of cleavers in a field, there's 2 things, and people, other people can feel free to jump in. So when you start to do rotational grazing, that really helps manage towards cool season grasses. And so if you can concentrate animals, graze that bed straw or cleavers when it's young, it's very nutritious. I've not heard of bloat when it's young. And so that's one way to control it. The other way is to mow when the plant is flowering. Whenever a plant is flowering, that's usually the weakest point in its life cycle and where it's most vulnerable. And because it's putting energy into making seeds. So that is the best time. Does anybody else have any bed straw tips? Oh my gosh, there's so many smart people on this. There's got to be.
My sheep actually clean me out. They like it. So if you rotationally graze it at the, as you said, the right times, they will pick through it. They like it, and they'll actually take it out. But I've never had any issue with bloat problems with cattle or cattle, horses, or sheep.
Cool, thanks. Janet says, does adequate lime help? I'm not sure that lime influences bed straw. Does it? Does anybody know?
Not necessarily. You get more benefit out of intensive grazing or managing it.
Pam says baling and allowing it to ferment as baleage. Okay. Yeah, with any Well, here's one thing that I like to tell farmers in upstate New York. And when I teach holistic management, I often am teaching to people all across the country and all across the world. And we are so lucky in the Northeast because we have two things. We have pretty much even moisture year round. And the second thing is we have cool season grasses. So these cool season grasses, the vast majority of them that are in our pastures actually are not native to the United States. They come from Northern Europe and the UK. And they were brought over actually in the 16 and 1700s through soil used as ballast in ships. And it's really one of the best free gifts to New York livestock farmers, the seed source of cool season grasses like orchard grass, fescues that are in our soil. And what I have found is it's not really about what you plant, it's how you manage. So if you're doing good rotational grazing, that is the best way to manage your weeds, your weed issues. And like with the example of the horse nettle is actually poisonous to horses, but in the really young phase, it's actually palatable and nutritious. So he ate it, no problem. Oh, Aaron says a quick web search shows no indication that bedstraw cleavers causes bloat. Yeah, that sounds right. I associate bloat more with legumes, and I don't believe, and bedstraw is not a legume. Okay, so great questions, everybody. I love it when this discussion happens. Here's just another study showing how if you do good rotational grazing, this is adaptive high stock density grazing versus continuous grazing, you get that soil organic matter deeper into the soil. And why is this? Why are you getting this organic matter deeper into the soil with good managed grazing versus continuous grazing? I've just been talking about it. Deeper roots, yeah. Oh, Aaron, yes. No fair, you're not allowed to answer. But yes, that is correct. Good job, Aaron. I also love showing this picture. This is a really cool picture. So if we're getting higher rainfalls and we want more of that water coming into our soils, is to maintain these pathways created by roots and living organisms. So this is actually a rubber mold of night crawler channels in a crop field. So you can see how worms can really be great aerators of the soil by adding these channels. This was a big paradigm shift for me when I learned that compaction is a biological problem needing a biological solution. A lot of people think that compaction is about heavy machinery or animals on soil. And while you may have situations where in areas where clays and silts and you've got a lot of animals trampling when they're wet, or machinery or trucks going on soils when they're wet, for the most part, it's really about having those roots in that soil. I've seen pastures where you have a ton of animals on them and concentrated, but they aren't getting compaction because you have enough roots holding that soil in place. It's when you have a lack of living roots and a lack of living organisms that you get compaction. Okay, and you can see this really well in soil that's tilled versus untilled. The soil on the left is untilled. You see all the clods and those little BBs. Those are the the soil clods, that's the structure, versus a soil, the same soil type, only tilled, it becomes very compact. And this is what happens when you put those soils, same soil, different management in water. I always love seeing this experiment, and it never ceases to amaze me. Another experiment I've had a lot of success with is if you take soil, some soil that's been tilled versus the same soil type that's been untilled, dry it, compact it down into a cylinder that's got holes in the bottom and pour water on top, you can see, even though you've broken up the soil, the untilled soil will infiltrate where the tilled soil doesn't. All right, so the next thing I want to talk about is temperature. So if we've got this increase of soil temperature, how does that affect things? So an increase in soil temperature is going to speed up biological activity to a certain point of temperature, which that biological activity is going to volatilize that organic matter. So you're going to have a harder time keeping organic matter in soil in hotter climates than in cooler climates. When you get really high soil temperatures, then it can discourage or kill beneficial soil organisms. So it speeds up biological activity to a point, and then when you get to that point, it starts to, above that, discourage or kill beneficial soil organisms. It's going to alter root growth and nutrient uptake, which is going to affect yield. And it's also going to influence soil evaporation rate. So for temperature of soil, microorganisms, the ideal soil temperature range is between 50 and 96 degrees. Once you get above 130, it is those soil organisms begin to die. When soil temperature increases, biological activities increase and organic matter decreases. For microorganisms, the soil temperature range is a lot lower. It's between 50 and 75 degrees. Now, okay, growth, the ideal range for nitrification and cool season grass growth is 50 to 75 degrees. Once you get above 80s, and I'm talking about soil temperature, not ambient temperature, many plants reach peak growth and peak nutrient uptake. And then 80 and above, plant and root growth starts to slow considerably. So this is in a potato plant, but you can see how as the temperature increases to about, that sweet spot of between 65 and 85, you've got your maximum root growth, and then above that, it starts to decrease. Soil temperature and moisture. So the hotter the soil temperature, the more it's going to evaporate. You get about a 1% loss or higher evaporation rate with each degree. Certainly other factors are going to affect evaporation of soil moisture, which includes solar radiation, wind, and humidity. But if you're looking at a soil temperature of about 68, pretty much all of that water in the soil is available for plant growth. At 88 degrees, you're going to get a 20% higher evaporation rate. And then at 98, it's a 30% higher evaporation rate. So you're losing more moisture the hotter it gets. Now, you might think, well, it doesn't get to above 90 degrees very often. There can be a huge difference in the effects of cover on soil temperature. So last summer, it was a hot day in June, and I took out my soil thermometer. It was about 93 degrees in the sun, or not, sorry, in the shade, but that was the ambient temperature. When I went over to a part of my pasture that was very tall, it was like 8 to 10 inches. At 1 inch depth, the soil temperature was 83 degrees. So a full 10 degrees cooler than the ambient temperature. When I looked at my mulched veggie bed, it was a little bit higher. I'm trying to move all my things out of the way. It was 90 degrees, so that was about a 1 inch of straw mulch on top. And then when I went to the overgrazed part of my pasture, that was less than 1 inch, the temperature rate rose to 108 degrees. So that is quite a bit different between tall pasture, and I mean, I was probably 25 feet away, so it wasn't very far. 83 degrees to 108 degrees. The bare soil, there was some bare soil in my garden that was 115 degrees. And the black plastic, I had some black plastic on the ground. I was solarizing an area. It was actually 128 degrees. So it may seem like, oh, I don't have to worry, it's not that hot out. However, when it gets warm and sunny, you're going to have a huge difference in soil temperature, and then consequently a lot more evaporation. So that is why soil, that's why some pastures really dry out so quickly. Some people might say, oh, when you're going into a drought, clip your pastures because then it will regrow when the rains come. I actually, in my pasture this summer, because we had that early season drought, I actually didn't clip until we got rains. And then because I wanted to preserve what moisture there was. And it was funny because a lot of my neighbors were like, oh my God, your pastures look terrible. And it's embarrassing, right? You know, here is, I teach pasture management and speak about it, but my pastures look terrible. But I was like, you know what? Those weeds are shading the ground. They're conserving the moisture. There's actually some nice cool season grasses that were green around the weeds when everybody else's pasture was dead. And a few people noticed, like, how come you've got green areas in your pasture and I don't? And it was because I kept those weeds. Now I did clip them when the rains came. Anybody want to comment on that? What are your thoughts on that? Tom or Aaron? Ashley?
I think one of the problems, I got lots of weeds in my pasture because it hadn't been used in 7 years. And so we've got enough weed seed in the soil that the weeds continue to grow. And what we saw this year when we had a dry spell, you're absolutely right. There was a lot of green down underneath for those animals to eat. So you looked at a lot of awful weeds, including burdocks.
Yeah, and I had a lot of Queen Anne's lace in my pasture, and man, I was like, oh, this looks terrible. But then I pulled a plant, and the taproot on that, I call Queen Anne's lace my tillage radish now, because it's got this great taproot that's breaking up compaction and putting in organic matter. Karina, you said as long as terrible is a temporary situation, sometimes it has to look ugly before it can look pretty. I agree. I'm starting to think that. So yeah, so less snow and frozen ground, longer mud season. You know, I think you're going to have to rethink our winter management and spring management because, you know, it used to be that we had frozen ground with a blanket of snow protecting it. And now you're looking at unfrozen ground, no snow for, you know, some of the winter. So more rain, you're going to have more runoff in those scenarios. So a good solution is tall grazing and stockpiling, especially if you have the space, and that those tall plants are really great at getting those roots down into the soil and increasing organic matter. Brett mentioned winter bale grazing, and I am such a big fan of this. It can increase organic matter. It cycles nutrients throughout the winter. No messy barnyard. It's not concentrated. You do have to, in many cases, have water, and there's time moving the animals, but it's a great way to increase organic matter and nutrients. Brett, did you want to say anything about winter bale grazing?
No, you're doing great.
Oh.
Elizabeth.
Oh, geez. Well, that is a good compliment indeed. Thank you. Gary says, we call them weeds, but they add phytochemical richness and biodiversity resilience. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out, Gary, for sure. So livestock farmers will also have some opportunities. More rain.
Sorry, can I ask a quick question?
Sure, yeah.
Sorry, this is a dumb question. The slide before, can you just what is winter bale grazing? Is it just like putting a round bale in pasture and moving them?
Yes, good question. So how most people do it is they put the round bales out in a pasture, kind of in a checkerboard pattern, and rotate them just as you would with a regular rotation through a pasture with polywire. You rotate them throughout the pasture. So they do have impact on that pasture, but they're not there long enough to completely destroy it. And the advantage is they're putting their poop and manure, or their manure and urine, they're spreading it out throughout the field. And Brett, it sounds like you also use it to have them maybe eat what's left over, trample in dead vegetation. Is that correct?
That's correct. So for us, it really started as a pasture improvement strategy. Really what pushed us into bale grazing probably around 15 years ago is on our farm, we have over a mile of frontage on the Watkins Glen State Park, which is apparently the second most visited park in New York after Niagara Falls. So literally within 100 feet of our farm boundary and spots, we have Glen Creek, which goes down through this beautiful park and then into Seneca Lake. And we didn't want to be the farm dumping a lot of nutrients into that watershed. So our old dairy barns here on the farm, they're sitting right next to creeks and gullies that drain directly into Glen Creek. Everything on this farm flows into Glen Creek. So any type of concentrated winter feeding was going to be disastrous. And John Wickham from Soil and Water came years ago and looked at our barnyards and said, yeah, you could spend $100,000 trying to fix this, but it's not going to make much difference. So it was what made us realize that if we were going to continue to grow our herd, we really needed a way of dispersing the manure and the fertility across the landscape. And much of our pastures at the time were also on old crop fields and hay fields that had been really cropped to death for like 20 years. And the first few years we started feeding bales on pasture, it was phenomenal to look at it in early fall, just that green up effect, every place where a bale had been fed. And your picture in the lower left-hand corner there, that's really, we don't push our cattle maybe to clean it up quite that much. And much, of course, depends on the ground conditions, whether you got good frozen ground, clean snow, or if it's muddy. But to us, it's just been a savior because it has allowed us to grow to about 100 cow herd without massive amounts of spring cleanup, without massive nutrient runoff into the watershed. And it's really been a cheap way of recycling the nutrients back onto the pastures. And I've also found our cows really like to go and lay on the waste hay. So we'll usually leave a few paddocks open from the previous few days where they've been. We're moving our herd either every 1 or 2 days in the winter. It just really depends on the ground conditions. And we have different paddocks set up with 1 day's worth of hay and paddocks set up with 2 days worth of hay. But in our case, we're not using the checkerboard pattern anymore. We're doing it extensively across the farm. And we have 130 paddocks across our almost 500 acres. So our cows love to walk back to that previous paddock or two and lay on that waste hay, and it just keeps them out of the mud and the snow and the frozen ground. And to me, it's just been all positives and really no negatives. But yeah, you do trample paddocks up a little bit. And in the fall of 2018, when it was like historically wet here and we had 20 inches of wet snow on top of quicksand, we had to lock them down for a few weeks. And that was the only time we've ever really had to resort to sacrifice paddocks. But and even though it looked terrible at the time, by middle of the following summer, we had built so much fertility up in those sacrifice areas through previous winters of bale grazing, it just bounced right back.
Yeah,
We're
thanks.
we're on gravel, by the way, too. And that's one caveat I would throw out there. If you're on wet, heavy soil, don't compact it. At least don't compact it any more than you have to. But our gravelly soil seems to be able to quickly recover.
Although I will say the pictures from this farm are a little bit heavy, and it worked very well on that farm as well. But Chet, maybe you want to, Brett, sorry, you want to answer Aaron's question. He said, wet wasted hay and bale grazing seems like it can get expensive for soil improvement compared to compost or added manure. Do you want to answer that?
Yeah, so I'm reading Aaron's last comment there. Wasted hay and bale grazing seems like it can get expensive soil improvement compared to compost or added manure. Well, I don't know, Aaron. That's a good question. The way so for our cow herd, we're feeding first cutting hay. And you have to keep in mind that when you cut here in upstate New York, when you typically cut first cutting hay, it's pretty stocky, usually has seed heads. And if you were trying to graze animals on that same thing, you frankly wouldn't be expecting them to take more than half of what was there. And that's where the mob grazing comes in, because you want them to clip that top better third to half and then trample the other 2/3 to half. So I look at our hay bales the same way, and our hay, the cows will clean up the hay amazingly well. But if they're leaving, say, 6 inches of really crappy stuff on the ground full of manure, I figure that was like the stocky stuff that they weren't going to eat anyhow if they were out in the pasture. Penn State did a study in 2007. I actually have a copy of it on my bulletin board in the office, where they determined that a ton of, I think the term they used was just good quality hay, but it was really like beef cattle quality hay, had at that time about $80 worth of NP and K in it. And I didn't really believe that, because you could buy hay at that time around here for, say, $60 a ton. And Penn State's claiming it has even more value than that just in the fertilizer value. But after I saw the green up effect in our pastures the first few years of bale grazing, I believed it after that. So that figure, by the way, I threw out earlier, the 1.5 million pounds of density, if you do the math, if you put 20 cows, say 1,200 pound cows in a 30-foot diameter circle, that's about 1.5 million pounds of density per acre, which is far more than I've ever been able to achieve through mob grazing during the green season. And that density is sustained for the several hours that the cows are standing around that bale devouring it. So it's just a silvopasturing friend of mine, Joe Orifice, he likes to call them bale bombs. And I think that's a very descriptive term, because So in the winter, we're always seeking to put our bale bombs on top of the multiflora rows or the little remnant patches of brush or the horse nettle or goldenrod or whatever that we couldn't get the animals to really trample and eat enough during the grazing season, and that really finishes off the job.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing your experience, Brett. I know we're after 3, so I will just finish up very quickly. So there is some opportunity for livestock farmers. I think you guys are going to be the best and most well-suited for dealing with climate change. You know, if you have more rain, that can make well-managed pastures more productive. There is also some thought that the higher carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere will be better for grasses. And then warmer winter temperatures will mean less frozen water sources and less animal weight loss. So I do want to come back to this question if we have time, but I just wanted to wrap up. I have been looking through some of NRCS's or USDA's photo on Flickr, and I came across this beautiful historical photo from the 30s. I do want to just leave by saying that the NRCS vision, the agency I work for, is a world of clean and abundant water, healthy soils, resilient landscapes, and thriving agricultural communities through voluntary conservation. And that is what we are working towards. So thank you for attending today. Thank you for what you do. I know this past year with COVID has just given me new appreciation for the heroes that grow our food. You guys are heroes. So hats off to you. And thank you for wanting just to make the world a better place while trying to feed it. And that goes for the people who serve them. So I'd like to, I don't know if we have any time for questions or comments, or if people want to share what has worked on their farm. I'd like to hear that as well. Oh, and just ignore the poll everywhere link at the bottom.
That was an excellent talk, Elizabeth.
Oh, thank you. Who was that?
Gary Clapel.
Oh, thank you, Gary.
I've actually just 2 comments, of course.
Yes, I'd love to hear from you.
First, we actually, I actually did a little project a couple of years ago where I looked at 21 different paddocks. I looked at pastures managed either by multi-paddock grazing, high density management, intensive grazing, versus continuous grazing versus hay fields where there's no grazing, just clipping. I looked at the microbial communities in all 3 types of pastures, and they were all in the Helderberg region. So everything else was pretty similar. And what we found is that there was really no difference in the microbial communities in continuously grazed pastures and hayfield soils. But in the multi-paddock managed soils, the intensively managed soils, we saw higher abundances of microbes, more different kinds, more diversity of microbes, and a better, higher fungal to bacterial ratios. And fungal to bacterial ratio, the higher it is, the more stable the carbon in the soil is. So that really, the data were really, really clear on those things. Yeah.
So Gary, can I just ask that? So you said there was not much difference between a continuous grazed pasture and a place that was ungrazed. There wasn't much difference.
It's being used for hay, so it's being clipped.
Oh,
but it wasn't
for hay.
being,
Okay.
Right, and so the microbial communities were statistically not different, whereas the multi-paddock soils or soils that have been managed by multi-paddock grazing, the holistic type of management, the the levels, the amounts and kinds of microbes, the diversity of microbes was much higher, and the stability of the soil as affected by microbes much higher. One of the things that does that, you mentioned roots dying back and degrading in the soil, but also there's this enormous communication between microbes and plants that goes on through the roots. So the plants are sending exudates, sugar down into the soils, and the microbes just thrive on that. And the fungi are actually going out into the fields, digesting things like manure and urine, bringing it back, bringing back the nitrogen and phosphorus and trading it for sugar with the plants. And this is pretty new stuff, but we're finding that really affects the carbon in the soil, the stability of the soil. They produce these glomerulins, which are like a glue that holds the soil together, not compacting it, but just holding it together. So it's really, there really does seem to be a difference between managing using multi-paddock, sort of mimicking nature, versus just continuously grazing the soil. Or the pasture. The other thing I want to emphasize really quickly or point out is there's something called COP26, COP26. It's the next step in the Paris Climate Accords, and they're organizing this right now. And I went on their website, and there are all kinds of experts being called in to help COP26 organize the next Paris Accords meeting. And there are bankers and business people and geochemists, or just all policymakers, all kinds of experts. No farmers, no agriculturalists. And agriculture and forestry, we talk about not putting carbon into the atmosphere, but agriculture and forestry are the only things that take carbon out of the atmosphere. And so I wrote to them and they said, we'll get back to you. But I think it's really important that there be farmers at the table.
Nice. Oh, Gary, I'm so glad you talked about that first part with the microbes. And I don't know if folks on here went to Grasstravaganza. Let's see, I guess it was 2 years ago at Cobleskill, and Elaine Ingram talked exactly about what you just said. And what was interesting to me was to learn that the mycorrhizae fungi in the ground is sequestering more carbon than the bacteria. So thanks for those comments. Anybody else?
Well, if not, then maybe we'll wrap up for today. One last call for questions or comments, though.
Anybody want to share anything that they think has worked for them to be climate resilient?
Yeah.
Oh, good, Kevin. I was hoping you were going to talk.
Thanks. No, but I think this improving the organic matter is probably one of the more important. Everything's tied together, so it's hard to say what's more important than the other. But one of our paddocks out back, one of our larger ones that we've been probably grazing now for, it's got to be 12 years, 11, 12 years. But below that is a swamp. And I noticed this during hunting season is okay, you're going to try to cross the swamp and you're jumping from bog to bog. Well, I don't know, seems like this last 7 or 8 years, maybe 9 now, we've had no problem crossing it. The water level in that swamp is not near as high as it used to be.
Interesting.
Is the water table down? So it's hard to say. But organic matter in this paddock, and one of the soil samples I just got back, it's 5.2%. So just a thought.
Yeah, does anybody know why wetter soils usually have an increased organic matter? Do you know, Kevin?
Well, my guess would be just because of the moisture and decomposition.
Yes,
Technically, no.
partly, but usually it's because so wetter soils tend to have more organic matter because the water will low oxygen environments will preserve carbon. So you don't have as much volatilization of carbon from microbes.
Gotcha.
Jim says we have more springs flowing longer into the summer. Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised because you're in Greene County, Jim, and I think Greene County has really increased their rainfall. Kevin, it may be that particular wetland, the hydrology is different. Maybe there's certain drainage that's happening. I don't know why that particular wetland seems to be getting drier.
Okay. But like I say, it's just, okay, I know my organic matter is increasing. So would that be a particular coincidence or what here, you know?
Oh, kind of why is the organic matter increasing in that paddock?
Right. And also and this swamp is getting lower. So is that just because of the organic matter, it's holding more water than allowing it to go into the swamp?
You know, it's hard to tell without seeing exactly what's happening in that situation. But my guess is your organic matter is increasing because you're doing, I mean, I've seen your farm. I know you do a really good job with managed grazing. So the better managed grazing you do over a longer period of time, the more you're going to see an increase in organic matter. Would you say that? Would you agree with that?
Oh, yes, definitely.
But I mean, would you agree that's what's happening at your paddock?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. And so like prior to you managing the land, how was those pastures managed?
Well, that large one had been a cornfield for several years. So this, when I had the opportunity to, when we started grazing and had the opportunity to seed it down, and I'm thinking, well, it was kind of wet anyways, so we're saved up, so it didn't get seeded right away because I want to put some tile lines in. And but like I say, there was a couple pretty bad washouts where the ground was actually, I mean, there was a ditch that from the erosion. You know, we plowed it in, filled it in, you know, leveled it off, seeded it down, put in a little oats to hold it, and so far it's worked.
Yeah, so you know that those cornfields are going to have much lower organic matter because you're tilling, you're burning up what organic matter is in the soil, and then you're not replenishing it like you would with forage roots, where it's those forage roots that are staying in the soil, that are dying off each year, that are really basically injecting organic matter into your soil.
Right. Oh, I agree with that 100%. And
Yeah.
but also on well, I've been the last few years too is not grazing as tight. I'm leaving a lot more cover, I guess. I say leave it, graze a third, eat a third, or trample a third and leave a third. You know, it varies, of course, to the amount and how much grass is actually there. But then as the year progresses, gets later in the year, then of course it gets eaten down a little bit closer and tighter. And I have been rolling out bales in the late summer, early fall to help compensate for that. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think that rule of thumb of graze a third, leave a third, and trample a third is a good management technique with your farm, because you're in the groove. You know, you've been doing this managed grazing for a while, and you've got a really good system down, for sure.
Okay, but to follow up on that, this is, you know, okay, you can determine what you're gonna grow by how you graze.
Yes.
Okay. What if I want grass and clovers to come in exponentially, but nothing else? So how do I manage for that? They never tell you how to graze for a specific plant.
Yeah, so, well, for clovers, you know, clovers, any kind of broadleaf needs sunlight. And it can't be, so that's kind of the disadvantage to tall grazing, is it's not going to really select for clovers, because they need sunlight because their surface area is, you know, it's like round and flat. It's not like a blade of grass. So tall grazing can select away from clovers, but you can also use that. So like I have a pasture that's all forbs. So I want to graze that short and cut that short, so that every time that plant gets cut, like if a forb gets cut in half, it can reduce its solar surface collecting area by like 90%. Whereas with a blade of grass, you're only cutting it in half. So when you graze forbs short, it can be very detrimental to them. Now, I know that just kind of contradicted what I just said about clovers, but clovers still need that sunlight to flourish. Did I make any sense at all just now?
I think so. We just acquired a neighbor's old dry cow pasture that was mostly forbs. And so we grazed that right down tight last summer. So we'll see how that progresses this year. It'll be more like a learning trial for us.
Yeah, I mean, for those old 4B hay fields, the best thing to do is, I think, graze them short, then let them rest, add nutrients. The more nitrogen that gets in there, the more you'll switch that to cool season grasses. I mean, cool season grasses are so competitive. As a biologist, I find them to be a pain in the neck, because if I'm trying to establish like a wildflower meadow or a pollinator field, it takes a lot of herbicide to kill off those cool season grasses. They're so competitive. Whereas for a livestock farmer, as a pasture owner, I love them because they're free seeds. You know, I haven't planted any orchard grass in my pastures, but it's all over the place because it's just so persistent. That seed is so aggressive that if you manage it correctly, if you do the rotational grazing and let that grass rest, it really is so strong.
Okay, thank you. I don't want to take up all your time. I'll let somebody else talk. No.
Hi, Karen. I just want to say hi, Karen.
Hello, is that Ashley?
No, no.
It's Elizabeth.
Elizabeth, oh my gosh.
She just actually stepped in the room here a
Yeah,
few minutes
okay.
ago. Perfect timing.
Yeah.
Anybody else? I mean, I could talk about this all day long, but I know other people probably have things to do.
Yeah, we probably should wrap it up. We're going about 20 minutes over, but it's such good discussion. You hate to stop.
I know.
You hate to stop. And certainly you got Elizabeth's contact information. And if you think of a question that you want to send along to her, I'm sure she'll get back to you. But I think in wrapping up, I want to remind people that we have another winter green up next Wednesday, January 20th, 1 to 3 p.m. And I know a lot of people around today are signed up for next week. And certainly, Elizabeth, if you want to sit in on that, you're more than welcome to do so.
Thank you.
Anything else, Ashley, in the way of wrap? We've recorded this. I assume we're going to send the recording to everybody that registered.
Yes, we can do that for sure.
So I know there are a few people that registered that were not on today.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Tom, Ashley, and Sammy. Great to see a lot of familiar names and faces on here.
Yeah, thank you, Elizabeth. All right, so
Hopefully next year we can all be in the same room.
Let's hope.
I think this worked and people got to interact, and they've said in the past evaluations that the thing they like most about the conference is sitting down at lunch with other farmers or actually sitting one-on-one with a speaker. And so we had a little bit of that today, even doing it like this virtual. So I think that was great.
all right, well, I'm going to stop the recording and thank you all for coming.
All right, thanks again, Elizabeth.
Very good. Thank you very much.